Minister Bennett, whenever you're ready, we're ready for you. Minister Bennett, do you hear me?
I'm not sure I heard what that was there.
Hi, Minister Bennett. We're ready for you whenever you're ready to begin.
Okay, great. Je m'adresse à vous.
I speak to you today from my home in Toronto on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Credit First Nation, where we pay tribute to Indigenous peoples who have lived here and who developed this land. First and foremost, we have a very heavy heart for the families and communities affected by the tragic news of the discovery of anonymous bodies in tombs in the former Kamloops residential school last week.
Work because of unknowing. The Kamloops Secwepemc First Nation has found their missing children. We will be there with the Kamloops and all communities across Canada affected by missing children and the legacy of residential schools and the intergenerational trauma it inflicted. Yesterday was the beginning of National Indigenous History Month. Today is the 6th anniversary of the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. They laid out a path forward for our country on how to heal and address the impacts still felt today from residential schools. TRC calls to action 72 to 76 specifically call on Canada to work with survivors, families, and Indigenous communities to locate their missing loved ones and the unmarked burial places in a culturally informed way. In memory of all the children who went missing while attending residential schools and in support of their grieving families and communities, our government has been working with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to develop and maintain the National Residential School Student Death Register and to establish and maintain an online registry of residential school cemeteries responding to calls to action 72 and 73. In 2019, our government made a commitment to continue the work started by the TRC and support the ongoing NCTR and to implement calls to action 74 to 76, missing children and burial information, with $27 million in funding that would be available to communities. Supporting survivors, their families and communities across Canada to locate and memorialize through ceremony the children who died or went missing while attending residential school is at the heart of this work. Since Budget 2019, we've been engaging with Indigenous communities impacted by residential schools and experts and former Commissioner Marie Wilson on the principles and design of the program. Over the summer and fall of 2020, we hosted a series of 16 virtual engagement sessions with over 140 participants, which provided a further opportunity for dialogue with a variety of Indigenous organizations across the country. This included many survivors groups and advocacy organizations, healing and cultural centers, churches and communities, archives and research institutions, as well as provincial and territorial heritage practitioners, knowledge keepers, and health support workers. They have been very clear. They want the work to be Indigenous-led, community-based, survivor-centric, and culturally sensitive. They wanted support for the research, access to archaeological expertise, and commemoration. We also learned about their wishes for appropriate commemoration, ceremonies, and markers, and reburial in home communities where requested. Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast are calling for support in this important but challenging work. Our government is there to support them, and we know that $27 million is a step in the right direction, but we will be there to support every community that wants to do this work. Communities will receive information today to access the funding, which will be distributed on an urgent basis. Today, we recognize 80% of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action involving the Government of Canada are now completed or well underway. Budget 2021 includes $18 billion to support First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation. Bill C-15, an act to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, passed the House of Commons and is now in the Senate. Last week, marking September 30th as National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, passed the House with unanimous consent. Just yesterday, MPs all came together to pass C-8 on the oath of citizenship. We know that there is much more to be done to further reconciliation and build a more fair and equitable country. Last Thursday night, I was totally inspired by the resilience of the leadership in British Columbia. Charlene Bello said that this would be an opportunity for healing and coming together. Kupke Kasmer told me that she was making sure the community was supported and bringing together the former Kupkes to organize the ceremonies that the community needs to unlock the healing. Communities know what they need, and we will be there to support their way forward. During the commission of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, I met CJ Julian, the courageous and inspiring survivor of the Picton Farm. I now consider her a dear friend. Yesterday, CJ reached out to me to speak again to her mother, Peggy Ann, a survivor of the Lejack Residential School in Fraser Lake in British Columbia. She has been deeply affected by the horrific revelation from Kamloops. The memories are streaming back, and she wanted to tell me her story personally. She was sent there at 4.5 years of age until she was 16. She was sexually molested by a priest. She hid. She ended up in jail. Her life was forever changed. Today, on the anniversary of the release of the TRC Calls to Action, we honor Peggy Ann and all the survivors and families like CJ. As the Commission dedicated its work to the children that were taken and the families left behind, we are committed to continue that work. And we thank you, Miigwech Kuyanamik Marcy.
Good morning, Tansi, Boshu, bonjour. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from my office in St. Boniface, St. Vital, City of Winnipeg, homeland of the Métis Nation, Treaty 1 territory, and a city that is now home to many Inuit. Merci à la ministre Bennett et au ministre.
Thank you to Ministers Bennett and Miller, and thank you for all of you for being here today.
The House of Commons held a very important debate that I had the opportunity to participate in on an issue which I have often spoken about. And I know this has been a very, very difficult time for many. The discovery of the remains of 215 children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School is a reminder of the consequences of colonialism for Indigenous people and their communities. We must never forget the victims, the children who were sent to these institutions. We must never forget those that came home, and we must never forget those that never did come home. I continue to think about the survivors. They are my friends, my community, And I think of the families of those that never returned and the trauma that this most recent news brings. Many Canadians are learning about this issue for the very first time, and it's important they know about the tragedy of residential schools and its continued impact on Indigenous peoples and communities. And this is indeed an ongoing situation caused by intergenerational trauma. My thoughts remain with the survivors, the families, and those that never returned home. We shall continue to work with survivors, their families, communities, and other partners to locate, to identify, and to memorialize the missing children and their burial places. Nous sommes ici aussi pour...
We are also here to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, and so I will give a few words on the matter. Continuous progress has been seen up north. The number of cases are declining.
Less than 10 cases. With high vaccination rates in the 3 territories, we can see the positive impact it continues to have. I want to thank the leadership of territorial and Indigenous partners, frontline workers, and public health professionals for all their hard work in distributing vaccines, keeping people healthy, keeping people safe. Our government recognizes the unique needs of territories and Indigenous partners, and by working together in partnership, we see the light at the end of the tunnel grow brighter each day, and we will continue to be there to support their efforts. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Miigwech.
Kwekwe Unusakut, bonjour, hello. I am joined here today by Chief Medical Officer Tom Wong of Indigenous Services Canada and Associate Deputy Minister Valerie Gideon. I'd like to note first that I am here on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. I will keep my remarks short. I am conscious of the fact that reporters probably have many questions on what's on the hearts and minds of all Canadians, and if it isn't, it should be. It is particularly heavy and painful and real for Indigenous peoples today. I do want to discuss briefly an update of what's going on with COVID as the continued battle to eradicate COVID is ongoing. And there is some positive news, and it's important to highlight it, but I'll be brief about it. Nous avons vu ce mois-ci des...
This month, we have seen encouraging signs that the pandemic is on the decline thanks to high vaccination rates. This can be attributed to the strength of Indigenous leaders. As of yesterday, we know that 697 Indigenous communities have ongoing vaccinations. A total of 508,000 doses have been administered, of which 180,013 are second doses. The number of vaccinations is steadily increasing, showing that the hard work of so many people in the country is paying off. In terms of percentages, we're talking about 80% of adults.
Yesterday, the 1st of June, we know that 687 communities, Indigenous communities, have vaccinations on the way. In total, 508,883 doses have been administered. 180,013 of those are second doses. The number of vaccines is increasing constantly, which is attributable to the work of so many Indigenous leaders across this country. We are close to 80% of Indigenous adults that have at least had a first dose. En ce qui concerne le nombre de cas,
with regards to the number of cases in First Nation communities on reserve, we are aware of 700 cases, a total of 28,600, or rather 860 cases confirmed, and there are 28,000 and unfortunately 343 deaths. In order to prevent the devastating effects of the pandemic on Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, we continue to provide flexible funding through the Indigenous Community Support Fund. As part of the 2021 budget, we proposed an additional $760.8 million in funding for the initiative. Throughout these difficult days, Indigenous leaders in communities in urban areas have worked tirelessly to keep First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples safe. I would like to highlight that $200 million of these dollars will be deployed immediately. This funding will give leaders and organizations the flexibility to continue to develop and implement solutions that protect the health, safety, and well-being of Indigenous people. Some of the ways communities have used the funding in the past include promoting food security, improving mental health services, and distributing emergency supplies. I am very pleased that the initiative is delivering funds directly to communities this week and is currently accepting applications for needs-based support. These applications can be made by communities and organizations, including those supporting off-reserve First Nations and urban Indigenous populations. I know the money will be well spent and will have a positive impact, and I invite the interested parties to learn more about the program and to apply today. Now let's look at what's happening in some places in Canada.
The Canadian Armed Forces continue to help with vaccination efforts in Indigenous communities across the country. They recently completed helping vaccination teams in First Nations communities in northern Manitoba. And responding to a request from the Government of Ontario, Canadian Rangers and additional CAF personnel will help provincial vaccination authorities with logistics and general duty tasks in various communities in Anishinaabe Nation, of course, in northern Ontario. Canadian Rangers are currently activated in Lac Seul First Nation, Moose Cree First Nation, Neskantaga First Nation, Attawapiskat First Nation, Fort Albany, and Kashechewan in Ontario, providing assistance with COVID-19 response effort. As we see those communities that are ahead of the curve, we also see concerning trends that are in fact instructive. Flare-ups in younger populations and in the unimmunized. Again, Canada will be there to act quickly and support communities through this. I would note that these are also instructive lessons for the rest of Canada. Dans l'ensemble, donc, le nombre de cas diminue.
Overall, the number of cases is decreasing and the number of vaccinations is increasing. This is good news, but as we have seen in recent weeks, outbreaks can occur unexpectedly. As we know, events like those of Kamloops show that there is still a lot of truth to uncover and to bring to the light of day.
Merci, Cho. Thank you.
I want to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I want to take a moment to share my profound sadness on the heart-wrenching discovery of 215 children buried at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. Based on the 2020 Statistics Canada population projections, almost 80% of adults living on First Nations reserves in Inuit Nunangat and the territories have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine, and 43% received a second dose. It is exciting to see this level of vaccination uptake among adults. The progress is echoed across the country as vaccine rollout for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis continues. I was pleased to see a drop in clinic led by the Be the Change YYC and the Aboriginal Friendship Center of Calgary that took place on the weekend to deliver COVID vaccines to locals experiencing homelessness. Indigenous communities continue to make tremendous efforts to vaccinate adults now that the Pfizer COVID vaccine has been authorized for youth aged 12 and up. It is important that the ramp-up efforts to vaccinate eligible youth in Indigenous communities in order to enhance community protection. Les communautés autochtones continuent.
Indigenous communities continue to make significant efforts to vaccinate adults. Now that the Pfizer vaccine for COVID-19 has been approved for ages 12 and up, it is important that immunization efforts continue to move forward to protect eligible youth in Indigenous communities.
As the weather gets warmer, we need to continue protecting our elders and our communities. We need to abide by the restrictions of public health. And we need to avoid crowds, wear masks, and wash hands. This, along with more vaccines, will help us move closer and closer to be with our family and friends this summer. Miigwech nakumek marsi.
Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions des journalistes, une question et une
We'll now take questions from journalists.
question and one follow-up. Operator, first question, please.
Thank you. Please press star 1 if you have a question. Veuillez appuyer sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. Our first question is from Christy Gorka from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hello, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to ask these questions. I wanted to ask Minister Bennett to specifically respond to the statement that was put out last night by the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Maurice Sinclair, where he details that survivors told the TRC stories, including the fact that some babies apparently were thrown in furnaces, allegedly, and that there was a request to the previous government that the TRC have the capacity to look into the children who never came home, and that request was denied. Is there any thinking on the part of your government now today that there is unfinished business and that there needs to be money or resources devoted to getting to the bottom of the truth?
Absolutely. Christy, it's I think that, the commissioners really heard a lot about the issue of missing children, and that's why the, calls to action 71 to 76, 71 for the coroners in the provinces and territories is so important in their work. I think the Commissioner Sinclair said that this wasn't what he expected when he began the work. And yet at gathering after gathering, this is what they heard. And so they, as a commission, asked for funding that they could explore it further. Now it's really important as the engagements that we've done that communities wanted to do this work themselves. They're very clear that this has to be Indigenous-led, community-based, survivor-centric, and culturally sensitive, and that they want access to the funding for research, for archaeological expertise, as well as commemoration, and that's what we are prepared to do. We have $27 million to begin that work. We know that right now that's urgent, as so many communities want to begin this work, that Kamloops began 20 years ago because of that knowing. And so we will be there for all communities to do the work in their communities in their own way.
And just as a follow-up, Minister, the $27 million that you're referencing today, I just want to be very clear. So in budget 2019, there was $33.8 million that was allotted for the initiatives that you describe, and we have learned that there's still $27 million that has been unspent that's in reserve. So is that what you're talking about today, that $27 million? That's from that $33.8 million envelope, if you will, from 2019. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct, because there was money that the NCTR needed to begin the work on the death, burial, and cemetery registry, and they are doing that work. There was a request that before we disperse the remaining funding, that we had to engage with communities and experts and survivors to design that program such that in those principles that I just iterated. And so with the help of former Commissioner Marie Wilson, we have done that work, and now we are ready today to communicate with family, with the communities themselves. If they want to begin that work, we are there to respond and get them the funding they need to do the work.
Minister Bennett, can you share part of that response in French as well? We have, or Minister Miller.
Oui, c'est une.
Yes, this is a commitment with survivors and communities for the design and principles of the work subsidy to determine what research will be done with each community. Today, we have a program to subsidize communities for their work so that they can invest as they see fit.
Je vais être très bref.
Very briefly, the point to remember is that we will be here for communities to meet call for action 72 to 76. Over $30 million will be deployed. There's a question of deploying this money to the communities that will take the very sad decision to start commemorating. This is a process that has to follow the various communities' priorities. We've received many requests, and I understand what the federal government would like to do, but it is not the federal government's position to take the lead. The federal government must support these communities financially to help them to mourn and to help them in establishing their own protocols as to whether or not they will continue with various searches and digs, which is always a difficult time for those who have lost a loved one. The federal government will be here to support these communities financially. And the community that has been the most affected most recently, that of Kamloops.
Merci. Thank you, Christy, for the question. Next question, please.
Thank you. Notre prochaine question nous vient de Raymond Filion de TVA. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Oui, merci.
Question. Good morning, everyone. My question is for Minister Miller. Discovering the Children in Kamloops will launch a debate on monuments in Canada, especially with regards to John A. Macdonald. What do you have to say to those who believe that these statues in the name of John A. Macdonald on buildings has no more place in today's society? Thank you, Raymond. And perhaps it's ironic that I'm in the Sir John A. Macdonald building. This is irony that should not be silenced. Let these voices speak. All Indigenous communities are mourning today. The pain is manifest in a number of ways. We have to be clear. John A. Macdonald was one of the architects of residential schools, of the intensive work camps and labor camps. But let's be frank and face this reality. I don't support people breaking anything or tearing anything down. There's a certain ignorance, rather crass ignorance of our history sometimes. Our role Our role as leaders and politicians is to contribute to this education, and given what has come to light this week, we note that there is still a lot of truth to uncover. This truth that is tragic for many Indigenous communities that have to relive tragic parts of their past, sometimes their own lives. And so this sometimes turns into hatred and anger. I don't want to judge it. Let people speak. I am of the mind that we should better explain our history and understand the role of the various protagonists, to see what these people did so as not to repeat these atrocities. Question: you've said that you want to listen, but are you okay with having a statue of Johnny MacDonald on the hill, or having names, or having his effigy on banknotes? You as a minister, or you personally? Answer: you asked me what I thought about these people and what they were doing and their fury. Now you're asking for my personal opinion. I believe that we should have plaques that explain what these people did so that everyone can see what happened. Johnny MacDonald is being targeted by many people in my riding in downtown Montreal. There are many others as well. The founder of McGill had slaves, as another example. These people existed in our past with terrible behaviors. But to destroy and to erase the past could have a complete opposite effect. We should continue to explain, we should continue to educate. When people break, when people erase, this justifies forgetting the past and looking away. If we have one lesson to learn, it's that we non-Indigenous peoples have to learn, and that the burden on education shouldn't only be on the shoulders of Indigenous people. It's not their role. It's also our role. We must educate ourselves, and we haven't been able to do so. I'm also aware that it's all well and good to ask the question to me, but we should also ask the question to those who are suffering the most, that is Indigenous peoples.
On va prendre une autre question par téléphone, ensuite des questions dans la salle. We'll take one more question over the phone and then turn to questions in the room.
Thank you. Our following question is from Denan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi there. A two-part question. For Ministers Miller and Vandal, could you please specify what exactly you have tasked your departmental staff to do in the past week regarding burial sites? And for Minister Miller, can you please specify how soon communities will be able to tap this funding? And does it not effectively reallocate the funding away from the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation?
Dylan, I think I can take that. The funding for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, as you know, they received a 10 million grant contribution as the endowment in 2016, and they are receiving extra, again, funding towards developing the registries on deaths, burials, and locating the cemeteries, and their work will be invaluable going forward. The 27 million that we're talking about today was always intended for communities, and the engagement we've done over the past year has explained what that program needs to look like, and the communities will all receive details of that today and how to access it, and it will be distributed on an urgent basis.
And then I think, Dylan, you had a question on what we're doing immediately to help communities and timing. I'll talk about timing first. We are walking at the pace of communities. I know people are eager to get answers as to what we will do nationally and what will the feds do. The reality is this is something that will be dictated to us by the communities that are affected. My present thoughts and actions with respect to what we've seen in the last week is to help the communities affected by the Kamloops Residential School, and I would note that there were dozens that had children taken to that particular school over the course of close to a century. So there are many communities that are hurting and grieving. They've asked us specifically to give them space. We know that they have immediate health needs, mental health needs, that we will fulfill in conjunction with the First Nations Health Authority that is acting equally swiftly. But over and above that, they have made a number of specific requests that we will fulfill as quickly as possible. I think Val can complete that because we have some recent news to that effect. Again, I know people are eager for answers, but we do have to respect the privacy and mourning period of those communities that are collecting their thoughts, putting together protocols as to how to honor these children, and that is something that we will all have to respect. But I think Val can complete some of the actions that we are doing at BISC.
As the Minister said, the First Nations Health Authority of British Columbia was really established for this type of purpose, right? To provide that First Nations-led support to communities that are in need. They have set up an emergency operations center to coordinate access to supports and services. We have offered surge capacity to that emergency op center when they might require it, and we have also assisted them to connect with partners to access surge mental health counseling supports. There have been supports over the weekend and this week, but in terms of this is not just a short-term need, it will be a medium and a longer-term need. And it will also be more encompassing and include many communities across British Columbia, and I would say across the country. So all of our regional offices and all of our mental wellness leads are also connecting with communities and with partners to be able to set up surge capacity that may be required. We are pleased that Budget 2021 has provided additional resources for mental health, which we will be able to access in order to be able to support that surge capacity.
And Dylan, Dan Vandal here. We are taking a whole of government approach to this, not only at Cabinet, but at caucus, National Caucus later this morning. Minister Bennett and I share a deputy minister, so our officials are working together, certainly at the pace of communities, consulting with communities of the North. This is traumatic, and as the TRC report indicated, the estimated number of missing and of children that died is underestimated, and so there's going to be more of these, and I think it's important that we are listening to communities and walking at their pace as a whole of government.
Thank you. And my follow-up is about the Catholic Church. The Church has still not handed over records about residential schools that it used to run, including the one in Kamloops. For each of the three ministers, do you want your government to exert public pressure on the Church to hand over records?
I think, Dylan, what I've said before is it's up to Catholics across this country to ask their church to do better, including not only whatever they have in terms of records that have not been shared, but particularly what we are hearing over the past weekend is the apology from the Pope is very much front and center of unlocking the healing for these people so affected by the revelation, but also from their experience in residential school for themselves and their families and the intergenerational trauma. They want to hear the Pope apologize.
Thanks, Dylan. Next question, please.
Ministers, the UN Human Rights Office says Canadian authorities at all levels should ensure prompt and exhaustive investigations into the deaths of Indigenous children. Will you commit to creating a national team to take this on?
Olivia, what we heard from the engagement is that communities want access to expertise, but they want to direct the processes in their home communities themselves. It needs to be Indigenous-led, community-based, survivor-centric in that community, as well as culturally sensitive. So we will be there to support the work in all the communities that affected by this, but we will make sure they have access to whatever expertise they need. But over the past engagement, it was very clear they don't want a top-down approach to this. In the same way as you know, Olivia, that in terms of what happened to residential schools, some communities wanted them knocked down. Some communities have, like Six Nations, have turned them into a museum. Some Kamloops wants it sitting there to be able so that people won't forget. And places like Tanaha and Cranbrook have turned it into a hotel and a learning center. So each community will have a different approach, not only to the research and the work on determining the facts, but also in the commemoration and the markers and the kinds of things that Commissioner Marie Wilson and all of the groups have been working on how this best be deployed. And it was pretty clear they didn't want it top down.
It's what we're hearing time and time again. The provinces, and to their credit, have reached out to discuss their role in Calls to Action 71, which implicates the corners of the province. But they know well that it needs to be done in conjunction with the communities, putting communities first. There are certainly some people that perhaps don't want those areas touched as they are sacred, while being crime scenes at the same time. So it is a very, very difficult choice, but to the credit of the provinces that I've spoken to, they have committed to deploy their resources, but in that respectful way of community engagement.
Murray Sinclair says there could be as many as 25,000 children dead. And he says that your government hasn't done anything to address these calls to action. I'm wondering how you would respond to that, and that why after nearly a week of this, after this discovery in Kamloops, have we not seen concrete actions from your government? You say you're taking the community's lead, and yet Six Nations and the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, they've called for Ottawa's help for funding to support searches, and you haven't said yes yet. Why is that?
Olivia, I think we have said yes. We will be there for these communities. Today, they will be able to access the funds in the ways that they see fit, and that's exactly what we've been doing. And I think, in keeping with your last question, it was very important that we engage in with survivors and with the former commissioner to understand how this needed to be, how the funds would be distributed. It's very clear now that it needed to be bottom up. It needs to be community by community, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Thanks, Olivia.
And I just want to add to that, because I think people need to consider scenarios of the feds making a grand pronouncement and people that are grieving and hurting, knowing that their cousins and uncles and aunts have disappeared, wanting answers, see this large announcement that the feds are rolling in and are going to plow over sacred grounds, crime scenes. I'm not Indigenous. I know how my ancestors died. I know where they're buried. But consider a second if I heard something about a government organization coming in and surveying, however uninvasive it is, my own burial plots. We have to consider, as Minister Bennett said, the needs of the communities and the needs of their members. So we've received a letter from Six Nations, and I've seen the letter from FSIN. We'll be there for them, but it has to be a process that is respectful, first and foremost of the mourning period that everyone's going through in Canada, but also the process that's been followed. The Kamloops communities have done this, yes, on their own dime, but pursuant to a long process. And right now they are a community in mourning and grieving, and they've asked for space. We've said we'll be there. I do not at all want to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that this is any reflection on Senator Sinclair's comments. I have the utmost admiration for him, and his words ring in my head on a daily basis about truth coming before reconciliation. But we have to recognize that people are hurting. We can absolutely reflect on the slowness of reconciliation, but now is a time where people are in pain, they're hurting. We need to respect that process. We'll be there, but you're not going to see the feds sticking their faces in this. This is the communities that have to be front and center, and we have to make spaces for Indigenous voices.
Why is this funding opening up just now after this discovery? Why wasn't it opened up earlier?
As the engagement took place, it was a matter of us then going with the details to Treasury Board to be able to explain exactly how the money would be distributed, and that approval has come, and we are now able to urgently distribute it.
Martin de Radio-Canada, pour poursuivre sur la question de ma collègue.
To continue on my colleague's question, why did the funding not come earlier? What it tells us is that this terrible discovery was necessary for you to finally act. Answer. That's not the truth. This is a subsidy that was in Budget 2019. After that, our commitment with survivors to articulate the methods and principles to enact the subsidy The subsidies are ready to be distributed to communities today.
Est-ce que vous voulez ajouter?
Do you have something to add, Mr. Miller? No, just the same answer. This has been announced in 2019. The funds were available and funds were earmarked for this discovery, but this is a decision that is to be made by the community and we'll be here for them. Question. Why did communities like Kamloops have to fund this themselves? Because you've been in power since 2015, let us not forget. Answer. They've been doing this kind of search for decades. Ms. Bennett has more to say about, could have more to say about Kamloops, but this search has been going on for many years and predates the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Clearly, now they have better technology, which accelerates this process. We are in a society that wants immediate answers, but that won't be the case. And I hope that the truth will be uncovered fully. Like Olivia said, we're talking about thousands of spirits that have been lost. Question. A lot of people are concerned that there have been many apologies and words bandied about, but will that actually lead to concrete plans from the federal government? You say that there is money available to communities for searches, but are you ready to announce something concrete?
Aujourd'hui,
today, a concrete announcement is a $27 million made available to communities today. And I believe that this is a first step to fully assist these communities, but today we begin.
Question?
Good morning, Ministers. Teresa Wright from the Canadian Press. I'd first just like to state for the record that I don't think that you've adequately answered the question about the $27 million and why it wasn't made available before now and why Kamloops had to find provincial funding, but I'm going to not waste a question on that. Minister Miller, I'm just going to follow up on one of my colleagues in French question on the monuments to Sir John A. Macdonald. Today we're standing in the building named after Sir John A. Macdonald, and it's come to my attention that there are some officials here in Ottawa that are uncomfortable coming into this building because of the name of this building and the legacy of Sir John A. Macdonald and his creation in the residential schools. So I know you talked about, putting up plaques or, putting up more information, but, there are many Indigenous people who think that doesn't go far enough. And so I'm wondering, do you think that this building should continue to be named after this individual?
Well, as I mentioned to your colleague in French, Teresa, it's no small irony that I'm here doing an announcement on this in the John A. Macdonald building. Some may think it's disrespectful. The discussions about John A. Macdonald have become far too partisan, far too quickly. Conservatives will remind people that John A. Macdonald fought for equal rights for women. And that was shot down by the other party at the time. And you can guess what that other party was. It's become very, very partisan. And I think as part of this, and as we reflect, and as we make sure that Indigenous voices are heard and at the forefront, we respect those views. So those officials that do not want to come in, we have to respect that choice. If we turn our eye, knocking things down, breaking things is not my preferred option. Turning my eyes away from things is not my preferred option. Looking at things as painful as they are, explaining why they are, is my preferred option. And along with John A. Macdonald, one of the founders of Canada, comes the dark realization that many people have looked away from, that he was one of the key authors of the residential and perpetuated the residential school systems. That from my continued discussions with people this week, I had a discussion with a faith keeper in Six Nations who perhaps his anecdotes are more piercing than any more atrocious anecdotes I've heard, or facts over the last week from friends. Talked about the Mock Institute had an orchard and had apples, but the kids couldn't eat them or they were punished. They had chickens, but they couldn't take the eggs because they were sent to the market. They got eggs. They got one egg at Easter. These were labor camps. So calling it a school is probably a euphemism that we comfortably look at. That needs to be explained. And as I said to your colleague in French, often that explanation comes from Indigenous peoples, and they've put it on their shoulders to explain it to us, and we keep not explaining it to our children. And, again, it's our children explaining it to us because now it's being taught in schools where it wasn't taught in my school. So while I respect the pain and the expression of people saying, we need to take this down, rip it down, it's an expression of pain, I understand it. I'm not a proponent of it. I think we have to keep explaining. We have to keep explaining so that we don't repeat those errors. And I think that is, when it comes to John A. Macdonald or any other person that was complicit in this residential school system, it needs to be continually explained. I think Minister Bennett or Dan has a view on it.
I was just going to say I think it was the December 15th final report of the TRC, the Commissioner St. Clair made it pretty clear he didn't want the event in the Sir John A. Macdonald building. And those will be the choices going forward. Some people have trouble even walking in the building.
Just so I can also add that not on the John A. Macdonald building, but on a situation in Winnipeg on Bishop Grande Boulevard in St. Vital. There is a discussion ongoing now on whether to rename that boulevard, and certainly the Manitoba Métis Federation are not in favor of that. So it's not all nations, organizations that are on one side. The Métis Federation were saying that they think education is important, and I think these are such incredibly important decisions that you need to have the conversation, but you have to make sure that people are educated on the history and keep the conversation going, because these are so important to have. And I think with the passing of Bill C-5, the Day of Truth and Reconciliation, which is now in the Senate, what an opportunity to actually go to the schools, the elementary schools, the junior high schools, and talk about truth and reconciliation on a national day. And I think that's where we have to lead this conversation on those conversations, those tough conversations, and to see where this goes.
And I think, Dan, just as you were saying that, I was thinking about the debate about the exoneration of L'Oréal, that there are two very different views on this, and again, it will be the community, the Métis Nation, that will have to come to the decision as a nation.
For my follow-up, today is the anniversary of the TRC. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the findings of the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, and the Native Women's Association of Canada has been very critical of the process that has been ongoing in that. Minister Bennett, I would like for you to perhaps address their concerns. They called it a fundamentally flawed process, and also if you could tell us when we can expect to see a fully costed, fully measurable national action plan.
Thank you for the question, and I think that from the very beginning, the Native Women's Association was leading the work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, from the Sisters in Spirit to the faceless dolls, to all of the work that they have done, and we're very grateful for that. I think that as we designed the process that had to include provinces and territories, the distinctions-based representative organizations, as well as focus on Two-Spirit, data, urban, that we ended up with a core working group that has done extraordinary work and will produce a national action plan tomorrow that I think will be the blueprint forward to move into that implementation phase with all the provinces and territories and all the distinctions-based governments and organizations as we move forward into the implementation plan. As you know, the budget 2021, there's $2.2 million there to support the work of the response to the national inquiry and to stop this national tragedy and have the access to justice, access to healing, and we will continue to do that work in partnership with all of those who are doing the work on the ground of keeping women and girls and Two-Spirited LGBTQIA plus people safe in their home communities as well as in urban centers and wherever they live. And we are committed to do that work going forward.
Thanks, Teresa. And we have time for one more question. Nous avons le temps pour une dernière question. Christian, go ahead.
Tansei, Christian Ashkote, CTV National News. Ms. Gideon, you talked about, support services available right now, 1-800 number and other supports available. I want to ask the ministers and Gideon as well, is there any money that's going to be put forward for funding for people that need support and healing in their First Nations communities, people that need support and healing spiritually, mentally? This residential school news is opening a lot of wounds in our First Nations communities, and they need this support, they need this funding, and I'm wondering, is there any money set aside moving ahead here for the people that are really struggling right now?
Yes, Chris, and just to echo your point, there isn't a single Indigenous community that isn't hurting. It's opening up wounds that were not closed, even if people thought they were closing, and we get that. We don't have a full sense of the impact of it. Our best sense comes through what we're seeing across the land through your reports and on social media. We've reached out to communities to get a sense for what that is. Our immediate focus has been the dozens of communities that had kids sent to the Kamloops residential school. That is the most acute need at this time. I think getting out the awareness that there is the Hope for Wellness line and the residential school survivor line is important for people, but there is a need that goes well beyond that. We are currently getting a sense of what that is. We don't have a perfect sense of what it is. We know that, obviously during COVID, the impacts on people's mental health has been tough. The announcement today has a strong mental health component, particularly the Indigenous-driven on-the-land options, which has been just so key in keeping people physically safe, but mentally well at the same time. So we know the value of that. Again, it has to come from communities. Whether we can completely fill it is something that we're currently trying to gauge. We sensed that through the budget before this news broke. But this is obviously a pivot point where we need to move a lot more quicker than through budgetary cycles. So Val can complete that in some of the more immediate needs that have been expressed. But I think that's sort of the state of play as of Wednesday morning.
So the Indian Residential School Health Support Program that's been in place for many years will continue with the budget 2021 resources that we've received of about $600 million over 3 years. That also enables us to continue supports to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, survivors and their family members and communities, as well as day school survivors. And this is really built through a common network of service providers that are Indigenous-led, that offer both the mental health and the cultural supports together in sort of a holistic model of service delivery. We also have a number of mental wellness teams across the country that can be deployed to communities to offer that support. And they are networked together also through the First Peoples Wellness Circle, and they can help to coordinate surge supports where they might be required. So we have been in touch with the head of that organization, in addition to the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, so that they can see what is available in terms of their networks. We do have to recognize, though, that people are burned out from the pandemic, right, in terms of health workers, service providers. So we do have that concern about, what can we do to support the workforce of mental health and cultural service providers as well, so that we can enable them to manage. They've had an increased demand now for many months. We've seen more than double the average number of monthly calls to the Hope for Wellness line. We've seen over 30% increase in terms of access to the non-insured health benefits, mental health counseling service, and we know that people are just working 24/7. So that's why we're assessing the needs, as the minister has said, and we're going to monitor. But I mean, at the moment, we are absolutely leveraging the resources that we currently have.
Mr. Do you echo Minister Bennett's call for an apology from the Pope?
Yep.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry. Is that Mark? That was to Mark.
You could have practiced your French again, Minister Bennett. Minister Bennett takes French classes in Quebec and keeps perfecting it. So I think our members of the media are quite surprised to see the excellence of her French. But yeah, the question was for me. I do. I'm not Catholic. I spent long enough in a Catholic institution to have a view on things. So I think it is shameful that they haven't done it, that it hasn't been done to date. Certainly my Catholic friends that I speak to believe it should be done. There is a responsibility that lies squarely on the shoulders of the Council of Bishops of Canada.
Thanks, Kristen. And that concludes today's press conference. Ceci conclut la conférence de presse, malheureusement.
Thank you.